A scammer stole from the elderly, but a K9 followed him home and exposed his secret stash. Elm Grove was a quiet suburban town, the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other by name and trust was a given. But beneath the picturesque surface, a shadow lurked. Victor DeLuca was known around town as a friendly face, always ready to lend a hand to the elderly residents. With his charming smile and soothing demeanor, he had earned a reputation as a community helper. But behind closed doors, Victor was a cunning conman, preying on the most vulnerable for his own gain. Officer Jake Carter, a dedicated K9 officer with the Elm Grove Police Department, had an unshakable sense of justice. He patrolled the streets with his loyal partner, Shadow, a German shepherd with a keen nose and a fierce protectiveness. Together, they kept the town safe. But even Jake was unaware of the extent of Victor's deception. For years, Victor had been building an empire of stolen wealth, using fake charities and fraudulent investments to scam the elderly out of their life savings. He lived lavishly, enjoying the fruits of his deception while his victims struggled to make ends meet. Victor believed he was untouchable, manipulating and intimidating anyone who dared to question him. His web of lies spread far and wide, ensnaring even the most cautious. And his next target was already in his sights. Margaret Owens was a kind-hearted widow who lived on Maple Lane, just a stone's throw from the town square. Her husband, Harold, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving her with modest savings and a small, cozy home. Margaret found solace in tending to her garden and baking for her neighbors. One sunny afternoon, as Margaret knelt beside her rose bushes, a friendly voice startled her. "Those are some beautiful roses, Margaret. You've got quite the green thumb." Margaret looked up to see Victor DeLuca leaning over her fence, his smile as warm as the summer breeze. "Why, thank you, Victor. I do love my garden. It keeps me busy." Victor nodded, his expression turning sympathetic. "I can only imagine how lonely it must get, with Harold gone. But you know, Margaret, I've been thinking. I have an investment opportunity that could really help secure your future. It's low risk, high reward. I'd hate to see you struggle in your golden years." Margaret hesitated, but Victor's kind eyes and reassuring tone won her over. "Well, I suppose it couldn't hurt to hear more. Harold always did say I had a good head for numbers." Victor grinned, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Excellent. Why don't I come by tomorrow and we can chat over some of your famous lemonade? Trust me, Margaret, I only want what's best for you." As Victor walked away, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the answer to her prayers, a way to ensure a comfortable future. Little did she know, she had just taken the first step into Victor DeLuca's web of deceit. Jake Carter loved his job. As a K9 officer, he had the privilege of working alongside his best friend, Shadow. The two were an inseparable team, united in their mission to serve and protect. On a crisp morning, Jake and Shadow set out on their daily patrol. The sun glinted off Shadow's sleek black coat as they cruised down Main Street, windows down to let in the breeze. It was a picture-perfect day in Elm Grove. As they rounded the corner onto Maple Lane, Jake spotted a familiar figure in Margaret Owens' driveway. It was Victor DeLuca, loading a box into his trunk. Jake's brow furrowed. Something about Victor had always rubbed him the wrong way, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Shadow, sensing his partner's unease, let out a low whine. Jake reached over to ruffle his ears. "I know, boy, something's not right with that guy, but we can't go on gut feelings alone. We need evidence." Jake slowed the cruiser as they passed Margaret's house, nodding to Victor. The conman returned the gesture, his smile a little too wide, his wave a little too enthusiastic. Jake's intuition gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. There was work to be done. As they continued their patrol, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was up to something. He just hoped that whatever it was, he and Shadow would be there to stop it before it was too late. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret Owens had entrusted her life savings to Victor DeLuca. She had been hesitant at first, but Victor's smooth assurances and promises of high returns had won her over. Now, as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the empty space where her bank statements used to be, A sinking feeling settled in her gut. She had tried to contact Victor for days, but he was suddenly unreachable. His phone went straight to voicemail, and his office downtown was locked up tight. Margaret's hands shook as she dialed the number for the Elm Grove Police Department. Elm Grove Police, how may I assist you? The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Yes, hello? This is Margaret Owens. I think I've been scammed. There was a pause on the line. Then the dispatcher spoke again, her voice softer. Mrs. Owens, I'm sorry to hear that. Can you tell me what happened? As Margaret recounted her story, tears streaming down her face, she felt a wave of shame wash over her. How could she have been so foolish, so trusting? She had worked hard for that money, saved it penny by penny for her future. And now, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The dispatcher assured Margaret that an officer would be by soon to take her statement. Margaret thanked her, hanging up the phone with a heavy heart. She knew it was unlikely she would ever see her money again. Victor DeLuca had played her for a fool, and she had fallen right into his trap. As Margaret waited for the police to arrive, she gazed out the window at her beloved rose garden. The blooms seemed to mock her now, a reminder of her own naivete. She had always prided herself on being a good judge of character. But Victor had proven her wrong, and now she would pay the price. Officer Jake Carter sat across from Margaret Owens, his heart breaking as he listened to her story. The elderly widow was clearly devastated, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She had lost everything to Victor DeLuca's scheme. I'm so sorry this happened to you, Mrs. Owens, Jake said softly, jotting down notes in his pad. We're going to do everything we can to find Victor and bring him to justice. Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I just can't believe I fell for it. I thought he was my friend. Jake reached out, placing a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. This isn't your fault, Mrs. Owens. Victor is a skilled con man. He's been doing this for a long time. As Jake drove back to the station, his mind raced. He knew Victor was slippery, always one step ahead of the law. But this time, Jake was determined to catch him. He owed it to Margaret, and to all the other victims who had suffered at Victor's hands. At the station, Jake buried himself in paperwork, searching for any shred of evidence that could link Victor to the scam. But the conman was careful, leaving no paper trail. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Jake slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. Shadow, sensing his partner's distress, nuzzled his hand. Jake scratched the dog's ears, taking comfort in his steady presence. We'll get him, boy, Jake murmured. One way or another, we'll make sure Victor DeLuca pays for what he's done. Victor DeLuca sat in his lavish home office, counting the stacks of cash on his desk. Another successful con, another fortune made. He leaned back in his leather chair, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. But as he savored his victory, a flicker of unease crept into his mind. That officer, Jake Carter, had been sniffing around more than usual lately. Victor had caught him watching the house, his K9 partner at his side. Victor shook his head, dismissing the thought. He was too smart for some small-town cop. He had been running this game for years, and no one had ever come close to catching him. Still, it wouldn't hurt to be cautious. Victor pulled out his burner phone, dialing a number from memory. It's me, he said when the line connected. I need you to do some digging on Officer Jake Carter. Find out everything you can. I want to know his weaknesses. As he hung up, Victor's eyes fell on a framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of his mother, taken years ago before she had passed. She had always believed in him, even when no one else did. For a moment, Victor felt a pang of guilt. What would his mother think of him now, swindling the elderly out of their life savings? But he pushed the thought aside. This was the life he had chosen, and there was no going back. Victor stood, straightening his tie. He had a meeting with a potential new investor, another wealthy widow ripe for the picking. The game was never over, and Victor DeLuca always played to win. Jake Carter was at his wits' end. Weeks had passed since Margaret Owens had reported her loss, and still, there was no sign of Victor DeLuca. The conman had gone to ground, leaving no trace of his whereabouts. Jake had interviewed dozens of people, followed up on every lead, but it was like chasing a ghost. Victor was always one step ahead. His tracks covered so well that even Shadow couldn't pick up his scent. But Jake refused to give up. He knew that every day Victor remained free, more innocent people were at risk. He had to find a way to break this case, to bring the conman to justice once and for all. One evening, as Jake pored over case files at his kitchen table, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his informant, a young man named Toby who had connections in the shadier parts of town. DeLuca spotted. Warehouse on River Road. Getting ready to skip town. Jake's heart raced as he read the message. This was it, the break he had been waiting for. He grabbed his keys and whistled for Shadow, the dog leaping to his feet, ready for action. As they sped towards the warehouse, Jake's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew he should call for backup, but there was no time. If Victor got away now, they might never have another chance. Jake parked the car a block away from the warehouse, not wanting to alert Victor to their presence. He and Shadow crept through the shadows, the dog's ears pricked, his nose to the ground. As they approached the warehouse, Jake heard voices coming from inside. He recognized one of them as Victor's, the conman's smooth tones unmistakable. Jake's hand tightened on his gun as he edged closer, Shadow at his heels. But just as they reached the door, a shout rang out from inside. "Police! We know you're there, DeLuca. Come out with your hands up." Jake's heart sank. Someone had tipped Victor off, and now the element of surprise was lost. He burst through the door, Shadow at his side, but it was too late. Victor was gone, vanished into the night like a phantom. Jake cursed under his breath, holstering his gun. He had been so close, but once again Victor DeLuca had slipped through his fingers. But as he looked down at Shadow, the dog's eyes fierce with determination, Jake knew that this was far from over. He would find Victor no matter what it took. And when he did, the conman would finally face the justice he deserved. Margaret Owens sat in her living room, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. It had been weeks since she had lost everything to Victor DeLuca, and still, the pain was as fresh as ever. She had tried to move on, to find some semblance of normalcy, but it was hard. Her savings were gone, her future uncertain. At night, she lay awake, wondering how she would make ends meet, how she would survive. But amid the darkness, there were glimmers of light. Her neighbors had rallied around her, bringing casseroles and kind words. The ladies from her book club had taken up a collection, pressing the envelope of cash into her hands with tearful hugs. And then there was Officer Jake Carter. The young policeman had been a constant presence, checking in on her, updating her on the case. He had a kind heart, and Margaret found herself looking forward to his visits. One afternoon, as Margaret was tending to her roses, she heard a commotion from the street. She looked up to see a police car speeding by, sirens blaring. Her heart leapt into her throat. Could it be news about Victor? She hurried inside, turning on the television. The local news was running a breaking story. A reporter standing outside a familiar warehouse. Police have raided a suspected hideout of Victor DeLuca, the conman wanted in connection with a string of fraudulent investment schemes, the reporter said. DeLuca himself was not present, but officers have reportedly found evidence linking him to the crimes. Margaret sank into her chair, her heart racing. It wasn't the news she had hoped for, but it was something, a step in the right direction. As she watched the story unfold, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Officer Carter was out there, she knew, working tirelessly to bring Victor to justice. And with the support of her community, Margaret knew that she could weather this storm. She had lost much, but she had not lost everything. She still had her home, her friends, her garden. And most of all, she had hope. Victor DeLuca was running out of options. The police were closing in, his hideouts compromised. He had underestimated Officer Carter, and now he was paying the price. He paced the floor of his latest safe house, a dingy apartment on the outskirts of town. He had to find a way out, a way to start over. But first, he needed cash. Victor pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. There had to be someone he could tap, someone he could convince to give him one last investment. His eyes landed on a name, and a slow smile spread across his face. Elaine Johnson. The widow had been one of his earliest marks, a trusting soul who had handed over her husband's life insurance payout without a second thought. She would be an easy target, a quick score to fund his escape. Victor dialed the number, his voice smooth as silk as he spun his tale. A new opportunity, a chance to double her money. Elaine was hesitant at first, but Victor knew just what buttons to push. He had done this 1,000 times before. As he hung up the phone, Victor felt a rush of adrenaline. The game was not over yet. He would get his money, and then he would disappear, start fresh somewhere new. But as he turned to gather his things, Victor's eyes fell on the faded photograph of his mother, still smiling up at him from the table. For a moment, he was transported back in time, to the small, honest life they had shared before the world had hardened his heart. What would she think of him now, he wondered. The man he had become, the lives he had ruined. The thought made his chest ache, a pain he had long tried to bury. Victor shook his head, pushing the memories aside. He couldn't afford to be sentimental, not now. He had a plan to execute, a future to secure, and he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. Officer Jake Carter stood in the evidence room, his eyes roaming over the boxes of files and seized computers. The raid on Victor's hideout had been a bust, but it had yielded a treasure trove of information. Jake had spent hours poring over the documents, piecing together the scope of Victor's crimes. The sheer scale of it was staggering. Dozens of victims, millions of dollars stolen. It was a web of deceit that stretched back years, a testament to Victor's skill and cunning. But amid the chaos, Jake had found a glimmer of hope, a name buried deep in Victor's files. Elaine Johnson, a widow who had invested with Victor in the early days. And next to her name, a phone number. Jake's heart raced as he dialed the number, praying that Elaine would pick up. If he could just talk to her, maybe he could find a way to lure Victor out of hiding. Hello? Elaine's voice was hesitant, guarded. Mrs. Johnson, this is Officer Jake Carter with the Elm Grove Police Department, Jake said, his voice calm and reassuring. I'm calling about Victor DeLuca. There was a pause on the line, and then Elaine spoke again, her words tumbling out in a rush. He called me, she said, her voice shaking. Just yesterday, he wanted me to invest with him again. Jake's heart pounded as he approached Elaine Johnson's house, Shadow at his side. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. If everything went according to plan, Victor DeLuca would be in custody by sundown. Elaine had agreed to help, to play along with Victor's scheme one last time. She would meet him at her house, wearing a wire, while Jake and his team waited outside. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance at catching Victor off guard. As Jake took his position behind a hedge, he felt a flutter of nerves. So much was riding on this, so many lives hanging in the balance. He thought of Margaret Owens, of the pain and betrayal in her eyes. He thought of all the other victims, the ones he didn't even know about yet. We're gonna get him, Shadow, Jake whispered, his hand resting on the dog's head. We're gonna make this right. Inside the house, Elaine took a deep breath, smoothing her trembling hands over her skirt. She had never been a brave woman, never one to take risks. But this, she knew, was something she had to do. For herself, for Margaret, for everyone Victor had ever hurt. A knock at the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. It was time. She walked to the door on shaking legs, every step an effort. And then, with a final steadying breath, she opened it. Victor DeLuca stood on her porch, his smile as wide and false as ever. Elaine, he said, his voice dripping with charm. It's so good to see you again. Elaine forced a smile, gesturing for him to come inside. Victor, I've been looking forward to this. As Victor stepped over the threshold, Jake tensed, his hand tightening on his radio. All units, stand by, he murmured. The suspect is in the house. And then, as if on cue, Shadow let out a low, menacing growl. Victor froze, his eyes going wide. What was that? Before Elaine could answer, the door burst open, Jake and his team streaming in, guns drawn. Victor DeLuca, Jake called out, his voice ringing with authority. "You're under arrest for fraud, theft, and elder abuse. Put your hands where I can see them." For a moment, Victor looked as if he might run, his eyes darting frantically around the room. But then, as Shadow took a step forward, teeth bared, the fight seemed to go out of him. He raised his hands slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As Jake snapped the cuffs around Victor's wrists, he felt a rush of relief, of satisfaction. It was over. After all these months, all these heartaches, Victor DeLuca was finally going to face justice. He turned to Elaine, taking her hand in his. "Thank you," he said softly, "for your bravery, for your help. We couldn't have done this without you." Elaine gave him a watery smile, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I just wish I had done it sooner," she whispered, "before he hurt anyone else." Jake squeezed her hand, his own eyes misty. "You did it when it mattered most," he said, "and that's what counts." As he led Victor out to the waiting patrol car, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. It had been a long and difficult road, but in the end, good had triumphed over evil. The victims would have their day in court, their voices heard at last. And somewhere out there, he knew Margaret Owens was smiling. Her faith in him, in the power of justice, had not been misplaced. Together, they had taken a stand against the darkness, and together, they had won. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and anticipation. In the front row sat Margaret Owens, her head held high, her eyes fixed on the man at the defendant's table. Victor DeLuca looked small and pathetic in his orange jumpsuit, his once charming smile replaced by a sullen scowl. He had been in custody for weeks now, his empire of lies crumbling around him with every passing day. As the judge called the court to order, Jake felt a swell of pride. This was what he had been fighting for, the moment he had dreamed of for so long. Victor would answer for his crimes, and his victims would finally have their justice. One by one, they took the stand, their voices shaking but strong. Margaret, Elaine, and dozens of others, each with a story of betrayal and heartbreak. They spoke of the trust they had placed in Victor, of the dreams he had shattered, the lives he had ruined. And through it all, Victor sat stone-faced, his eyes cold and unrepentant. He showed no remorse, no shame for the pain he had caused. It was as if he truly believed he had done nothing wrong, that his victims had somehow deserved their fate. But as the evidence mounted, as the true scope of his crimes came to light, even Victor's facade began to crack. The jury deliberated for mere hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers, tears of relief streaming down faces. Margaret turned to Jake, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "for never giving up, for fighting for us." Jake hugged her tightly, his own eyes damp. "It was my honor," he said softly. "You showed me what true strength looks like." As the bailiff led Victor away, Jake couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. For all the justice that had been served, for all the lives that had been saved, there was still so much pain, so much damage that could never be undone. But as he looked around the courtroom, at the faces of the survivors, the ones who had stood up and spoken out, he felt a flicker of hope. They had lost much, but they had not lost everything. They still had their courage, their resilience, their unbreakable spirits. And with time, Jake knew they would heal. They would rebuild their lives, forge new dreams from the ashes of the old. They would learn to trust again, to love again, to hope again. Because in the end, that was the true power of justice. Not just to punish the guilty, but to lift up the innocent, to give them back their voices, their dignity, their faith in a better tomorrow. And as Jake walked out of the courthouse, Shadow by his side, he knew that he would always be there to fight for that tomorrow. For Margaret, for Elaine, for all the ones who needed a champion. It was more than just a job, more than just a calling. It was a promise, a sacred trust. And it was one that Jake Carter would never, ever break. In the weeks that followed Victor DeLuca's conviction, a change came over Elm Grove. It was subtle at first, a gradual lifting of the shadow that had hung over the town for so long. But as the days turned into months, the transformation became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now stopped to chat on the sidewalk, sharing stories and laughter. The community center, long shuttered and forgotten, reopened its doors, offering classes and events for all ages. And at the heart of it all was Margaret Owens. The once timid widow had blossomed into a force of nature, a beacon of hope and resilience for all who knew her. She organized fundraisers and support groups, reaching out to Victor's other victims with a compassion born of shared pain. She even started a community garden, transforming a vacant lot into a lush oasis of flowers and vegetables. It was there that Jake found her one sunny afternoon, kneeling among the tomato plants, her face flushed with exertion and joy. "Look at this place," Margaret said, gesturing to the riot of color around her. "Look at what we've built together." Jake smiled, his heart full. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "You're beautiful." Margaret ducked her head, a blush staining her cheeks. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "Without everything you did for me, for all of us." Jake shook his head. "You give me too much credit," he said. "You're the real hero here, Margaret. You showed us all what it means to be strong, to never give up." Margaret stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "We all have that strength inside us," she said. "Sometimes it just takes someone to help us find it." She reached out, taking Jake's hand in hers. "And I'm so grateful that someone was you." As they walked hand in hand through the garden, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. The battle had been long and hard, but in the end, love had conquered all. Love for a community, for a cause, for each other. And as he looked out over the bustling streets of Elm Grove, Jake knew that Victor DeLuca had been wrong about one thing. Trust was not a weakness, not a liability. It was a strength, a bond that could never be broken. Because in the end, it was trust that had brought them together, trust that had seen them through the darkest of times. Trust in the goodness of others, in the power of hope, in the unshakable belief that justice would always prevail. And with that trust, Jake knew there was nothing they couldn't achieve. No challenge they couldn't overcome, no dream they couldn't make real. The future was theirs, bright and boundless and full of promise. And together, hand in hand, heart to heart, they would seize it with everything they had. 1 year later, Elm Grove was a different place. The scars left by Victor DeLuca had begun to fade, replaced by a new spirit of unity and hope. And nowhere was that spirit more evident than at the dedication of the town's newest landmark, the Margaret Owens Community Center. The crowd that gathered on that crisp autumn morning was a testament to the change that had swept through the town. Young and old, rich and poor, they came together to honor the woman who had shown them the way, who had taught them the true meaning of courage and compassion. As Margaret took the stage, her eyes shining with tears of joy, Jake felt his heart swell with pride. This was her moment, her triumph, and he couldn't have been happier to be a part of it. "Today is not about me," Margaret said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "It's about us, about the community we've built together. It's about the power of love, of hope, of never giving up on each other." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces before her. "When I lost everything to Victor DeLuca, I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left to give, nothing left to live for. But then I looked around me at the faces of my neighbors, my friends. I saw the love in their eyes, the strength in their hearts. And I knew that I was not alone, that I had never been alone. Together, we picked ourselves up. We dusted ourselves off and we started to rebuild. We leaned on each other, we lifted each other up. And slowly but surely, we began to heal." Margaret's voice cracked with emotion, but she pressed on. "And now, look at us. Look at what we've achieved, what we've overcome. Look at the love that surrounds us, the hope that guides us. This community center is more than just a building. It's a symbol of everything we stand for, everything we believe in. It's a place where anyone can come to find support, to find friendship, to find a way forward." She turned to Jake, her eyes shining with love. "And none of it would have been possible without the man who stood by my side through it all. Officer Jake Carter, the hero who never gave up, who fought for us even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Jake felt tears prick at his eyes as the crowd erupted in applause. He had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be a hero. But in that moment, he knew that he had found his true calling, his true purpose. As Margaret stepped down from the stage, Jake gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "I love you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you more than I ever thought possible." Margaret smiled up at him, her face radiant with joy. "I love you too," she said softly, "and I always will." Around them, the celebration continued, laughter and music filling the air. But for Jake and Margaret, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, lost in a moment of perfect happiness. They had been through hell together, had faced the darkest of demons and emerged stronger for it. And now, as they stood on the threshold of a new beginning, they knew that there was nothing they couldn't achieve, no dream they couldn't make real, because they had each other and they had their community. They had the love that bound them, the hope that sustained them, the courage that would always see them through. And with that love, that hope, that courage, the future was theirs. A future bright with promise, full of joy and wonder and endless possibility. A future they would face together, hand in hand and heart to heart, now and forevermore.